In this lesson, the second lesson, we will be taking a look at the literary context as well as the genre of the letter of Colossians. And the reading for this lesson is Colossians 2, verses 4 through 23. So we're not even at Colossians 1 yet, but there is a reason for this, as this is the second part of the introduction to the book. So the literary context, let's call that the immediate circumstances in the Colossian church that prompts Paul to write this specific letter, which plays in very closely with what we looked at in the first lesson. And we'll also talk a little bit about the genre of writing, the epistle, the letter, and which again we sort of prefaced in the first lesson. But in this lesson, we're going to take a little more of a closer look at what those are. So as I said in the previous lesson, the book of Colossians, like so many of the New Testament books, is not a book in any traditional sense. It is a letter. When these letters were written, they were not written with chapter breaks and verses. Those were things that later editors put in, and they're incredibly helpful for us when we read these letters to find specific points of reference. However, when they were not written that way. They were written on parchment and scrolls and scraps of paper and kind of whatever was available. There were many of these letters, what are known as prison epistles. These things were written by Paul and others in prison. And so the idea that this was any sort of codified, you open it and read it with pages the way we do it now, it's unfounded historically. It's just nonsense. So it was written and meant to be read straight through. So there's no pause for a chapter break here, pause for a paragraph break there type thing. It's written as a singular cohesive thought, in other words. So especially when you get to Colossians and Ephesians and Galatians, a lot of these shorter letters, if you will, it really is best to try to sit down and read them straight through. It's a challenge and it's a trick, but it really does help you grasp the flow of thought better than trying to break them up and read them differently. And a good rule of thumb when approaching an epistle in terms of interpretive method, two things that I tend to tell people. The first is to identify the author of the letter, who is writing it, and the second is to identify the intended recipient. There's an idea that every word of the Bible was written specifically to me, sitting here in the 21st century. And that simply isn't true. The book of Colossians was written to the Colossians, not to me or you sitting here in the 21st century. You and I can read that, and we can certainly glean things from that. But the intended recipient of the letter that Paul wrote was the church at Colossae. And, we've already established the author, that's Paul, and the intended recipient would be that church. So those two things are taken care of, and we will revisit that as we begin looking at the first chapter of the letter. Now, last lesson, we looked at this major issue in the early church, the relationship between the Old Testament law and the New Testament Gentile believer. There were many Jewish followers of Jesus, as we read in Acts chapter 15, some even from the party of the Pharisees, who had this idea that the Gentiles who adopted Christianity, who put their faith in Jesus, had to begin abiding by the Old Testament law of Moses before their faith could be considered genuine. They had to undergo circumcision, and they had to begin following all of these rules laid out in the law. Well, what you will see as you read Colossians chapter 2, verses 4 through 23, is that in large part Paul writes this letter to the Colossian church because these people are active in the Colossian church and teaching these Gentiles things. You will see that Paul tells them in this section, I write these things so that you're not taken captive by all of these different philosophies and teachings, and no one is to stand in judgment of you. No one is to stand in judgment of what you're eating or what you're drinking or what you're doing in terms of the Sabbath, and those are all things that are coming out of the law. The purpose of this lesson is to reinforce that the purpose of the letter to the Colossians is to address issues very similar to the ones addressed in Acts chapter 15. It is establishing a very tight continuity here. And the purpose of doing this is to show that in its historical context and its literary context, the immediate circumstances going on in the church at Colossae, prompting Paul and Timothy even to write this letter, has a very tight context. It has a very specific purpose. And if you and I want to interpret what is being written in this letter accurately, we have to account for that. What we don't want to do is bring our 21st century problems into the world of the text, drop them on top of the text, and then try to shove them into the text and say, well, this is what Paul is talking about, because that simply isn't the case. That's not a good interpretive method. We just have to come to terms with the fact that you and I will face issues in life that Paul simply doesn't address in the letter of Colossians, and that's not a bad thing. What is important for you and I is to understand what Paul is driving at in Colossians. And when you sort of make that shift from what I want the text to say to what the text is actually saying, that is when theology is done well, and that is when you really begin to learn some interesting stuff about how these people viewed the gospel they were teaching and the true liberating power it carried.